we have some time now for questions and answers. Obviously, Roman is here, but our experts are at the back of the room as well, and we'll have roving mics. So if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to stand up, give us your name, and then give us your question as well. So following our introduction, are there any questions from the room right now? Always difficult to be the first person to start off. Thank you. Table 3, if we can get Connor's coming over to you with the microphone now.
Thank you, Roman. Sorry, my name's Fiona Egan, and thank you really very much, Roman. We all thought your presentation was very impactful, and we particularly were interested in this Japanese concept of actually having a group and where we might implement that in other areas. I was just wondering if you knew what kind of accountability was there on that Japanese level for making sure that their decisions were actually taken into account, or was it registered somewhere that, you know, did the person who ultimately maybe ignored that suggestion, were they held accountable, or were they recorded as having ignored the 7th generation? And maybe that's something we might look into recommending at a local level here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Fiona. So it's really interesting, that question of, in those kinds of assemblies like that Future Design in Japan, you know, do the politicians listen to them? What impact do they have? And the way it started in Japan was that when they had the first Future Design assemblies and they invited local citizens, they had local politicians were also part of it, kind of as members. And then from that stage, then the local government and politicians started doing future design themselves amongst their own employees, and they then opened a future design office in the town of Yahaba, where I'm wearing this gown from. So all of the major decision-making now in that town, anything that has anything to do with the future, whether it is about aging populations or biodiversity loss, goes through this process. So it's kind of quite integrated into it. But as you know, with citizens' assemblies, wherever they are in the world, they tend not to, what you say isn't necessarily put into practice. But the power that you have is a kind of power to persuade, as you're being representative, of the population. And I think that that's a really powerful thing in itself, just to have these discussions and have them outside the short-term, fast time of daily politics, but this is sort of more slow-time deliberation. And I think future design is one of those sort of models that we can look to.
Just on that point, Fiona, and just to remind people in the room that the reason that citizens' assemblies are so successful in Ireland is that they have been taken seriously by the government and by the House of the Oireachtas as well. So when it was established last February, the government committed to taking a report and to consider and to provide a formal response in the Dáil chamber in a special debate. So in cases where they accept your recommendations, they will explain when they're going to be implemented, and where they have a difficulty with recommendations, they'll explain why they have a difficulty as well. So citizens' assemblies all around the world fail because they're not implemented. The reports lie on shelves, but ours don't. So the government, you mightn't often believe it, but the government are really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this, because they don't know the answers and they're hoping and praying that you do.
Thanks, Art. We'll do our best to make sure that they don't forget us at the end of the process as well. Thank you. So we have another question from table 6, and Caroline is on her way with the microphone.
Hi, I'm Hilary from Cork. I'm just interested in that point you raised, Fiona, and just the Japanese. I'm just interested because culturally, Japan is very different to us, and discussions like that, in Ireland, there's a lot of we're quite vocal and everything else, but culturally, the Japanese aren't kind of like that in my experience. So I'm just wondering, how things like that would work in our culture versus their culture, and do you see any sort of interesting challenge from that point of view?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think they'll work even better in this culture, because actually when I've spoken to the founders of Future Design, they said actually it was quite difficult getting the conversations going, because there was like so much reverence for older people and the younger people didn't want to speak up and things like that. And there are quite a lot of cultural barriers in Japan. And in fact, that future design method has now been used in other countries as well. I've been part of experiments in the Netherlands and other places being used in Spain, and it's been very, very successful. So I just sort of think that when you bring people together, like you are here today, it has, you know, everyone's got their own experience to draw on. It creates a kind of energy, and as long as sort of people feel free to speak, it can be very, very effective. So actually, my hunch, I can't give you the data to prove it, is that those kinds of methods are actually more successful. And I think that partly is reflected in the fact that citizens' assemblies like this have been exploding across Europe at the local, regional, and national level. So it really says something about their power.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Hilary. I wonder if we could have an Irish Chris instead of a kimono for if we were to do it in Ireland. Are there any other questions? Great. So table 11.
Hello, Jean. I have a question for Ronan. You mentioned life creates life, or you quoted a lady who said life creates life, and effectively that nature takes care of the place, and effectively stating we should copy that. But I'm wondering, how does that work in real life, in that do animals not compete to create life, in that the lion eats as many wildebeest as it wants, the wildebeest eats as much grass as it wants. They don't actually care about the place. They just eat as much as they want and get eaten. So it's competition that takes care of the overall. So I'm just wondering how that squares with what was stated.
I'm sure there are probably some experts here that can talk about that first, but I can say something about it, but maybe... Yeah? Well, I just say that, yeah, of course, there's competition in the living world. But what we tend not to find is that we tend not to find particular species completely destroying their habitats. Yes, there is, you know, lions eat animals and all sorts of creatures may well try and occupy the nests. Some birds occupy the nests of others. But I think the big picture of evolutionary development is one not of... what we don't find is the creatures in the living world doing the equivalent of polluting rivers, you know, or razing down their forests and that kind of thing. And that, I think, is the challenge for us. But recognizing, of course, that human beings, we're serpents and doves. You know, we are competitive, but we're also cooperative. We have all these things inside us. But I think at these moments of history, we need to be thinking about the connections between us and future generations and working with our cooperative natures, something that human beings are really good. I mean, we're more cooperative than almost any mammal except the naked mole rat or something like that, I heard someone once told me. So I think we can work with that.
Thanks, Roman. And I might ask one of our experts to respond to Jean's question as well. Jenny, thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the excellent question. So if we think about it in terms of the whole Earth as an organism, a superorganism, so that would be kind of like the Gaia theory. And if you think that the Earth is made up of the biosphere, all living things, and the biosphere it can change climate. So half of the water in the atmosphere comes out of the leaves of tropical forests every year. So the power of the whole biosphere is actually changing our climate, it's changing our atmosphere. And how the biosphere interacts with climate and it interacts with rock. So we've had what's called a Goldilocks planet for all of Earth history. It's never been too hot, it's never been too cold, and this is controlled by life. So we think, oh, rocks are important and atmosphere is important and climate is important, but really the reason Earth has stayed within these livable climates is because of the biosphere. So probably not a great explanation, but I'll think about it more over the next few hours.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jenny. No, I think the vision of the interconnectedness responds to it in that regard. Okay, so thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, table 14 and 12 as well. Sorry, so whoever has the microphone first. 14, Connor, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Liam. Would Ronan please comment on the contribution that good planning can make to our attempts to solve all these huge problems? Because to say that current planning comes up with some most peculiar decisions is putting it mildly.
Thank you, Liam.
I didn't quite hear all of that question. Can you just...
The contribution that good planning can make.
Oh, good planning.
Yes, and what sort, and the harm that bad planning, poor planning, and planning done without appropriate consultation with the community, the issue of planning in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, I think that whole idea of cathedral thinking speaks to that, or the importance of, our governments planning for the risks facing society. We saw that very much with COVID, of course. We saw some countries that had, pandemic response plans in place, like Taiwan, dealt very effectively, with the early stages of COVID. Those countries which didn't have those long-term plans in place didn't deal very effectively. And I think it's the same in many of these, ecological areas as well. And there needs to be more of that kind of long-term cathedral thinking. And we know, human beings have this great capacity to do this. I sometimes think we've got like a marshmallow brain and an acorn brain. The marshmallow brain is the part of our brain which is all about short-term rewards. We want to click the buy now button. We want to eat the snack. But we also have this acorn brain. You mentioned that planting the acorn and the growing of the oak tree. I think that's the part we need to draw on, particularly when it comes to, planning. And I know there have been questions about, well, how much, over the last 30 years in this country, how much response has there been from government to knowledge about biodiversity loss, and what kind of planning is going to be required in the future to, action today, but action for future generations to deal with those challenges.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks for that question, Liam, as well. And we'll take one more question from table 12.
Hi, my name's Joe. Thanks for the presentation. It was very good. I suppose my question is more of a philosophical nature, considering your background. So when I was listening to you, I was thinking of Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Hegel's dialectical materialism, and I was just thinking in the society, there is much manufactured consent as has been written in the past. So I suppose, how would we put apart a theoretical framework before we engage in the practice itself?
Great question. Manufactured consent, Hegel, Zizek, the philosophical big hitters. I think in terms of conceptual framework, maybe I think about these things too simply, but my conceptual framework is my daughter. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So, that exercise that I got you to do? When I first did that myself, I was imagining my daughter, who was then 10 when I did it. I was imagining her at the age of 90. And the realization I had was that my daughter at age 90 is not going to be sort of alone in the world. She's going to be part of a web of human relationships and part of the web of the living world. The air she breathes, the water she drinks. And suddenly when I did it, I realized that if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. Right? It was a sort of a jump, in a philosophical sense, from the individual to the universal. And in terms of a philosophical framework, as it were, that's how I look at it in terms of the things that I care about in my life, actually, like my daughter's and my kids' welfare, is actually something that, connects us all. That world we want to create is one that they will all inherit. So if we do something for the people we love and the places we love, that will help the generations to come. And, philosophically, I think, for me, that also comes from a place of, the idea of the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. We can also stretch that through time. Do unto future generations how you'd wish past generations to have done to you. And it's very different from, Hegel and Zizek and Marx and all that kind of stuff, but it comes from a different tradition. But that's how I think about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Roman. And thank you, Joe, for making me realise there's a whole other section of things that I could learn about in order to benefit the work of the group. That concludes our introduction section.